If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review the Succubus Club, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. In the latter months of 2023, I produced a video talking about my burnout regarding actual plays, which was my only form of playing and running TTRPGs at the time. I will put up a card in the full video, but one of the things I touched upon is that when I started to run the occasional in-person game at my local game store and more private games for friends online, I began to enjoy running games again as they were originally intended. With the burden of putting on an online show with a bunch of amateur actors and hypocritical hopefuls stepping on and over each other to be the next micro-celebrity within the niche communities hoisted from my heavy shoulders, I could focus on what I do best, making awesome YouTube content my way, criticizing and shaming a Sweden-based company that seems to get a free pass constantly with its fuck-ups and running safe horror experiences with my friends. The result of this breakthrough came in the form of my ongoing Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition Chicago by Night Chronicle, which you can learn all about by checking out the playlist that will pop up at the end of the video, where I talk about it in the form of a campaign diary. Whilst I was very confident in my abilities to run a game set in Chicago using the 5th edition sourcebook, I did feel there were some notable gaps in my knowledge that I wanted to rectify. How did Portia obtain the Succubus Club? What does it look like, and how did it come to fruition? What is the deal with the guru in Chicago, and what is this war that was mentioned a couple of times? What was Loden like as the prince before Kevin Jackson stepped up? Who is Maxwell? What happened to these mentioned but clearly absent characters? These were some of my many questions that I demanded answers to, and there was only one way I could fix that: splurge my monies on older VTM books focused around Chicago. So, on to DriveThruRPG I went and bought two chunky boys, the Chicago Chronicle Volumes 1 and 2, with Volume 3 being a PDF-only affair, which is highly disappointing. Come on, DriveThru, get your shit together. The first two volumes contain Chicago by Night 1st edition, the Succubus Club in the first volume, with the second volume housing Chicago by Night 2nd edition and Under a Blood Red Moon, a mostly Well the Apocalypse Chronicle. In the previous episode, we had a look at the Chicago by Night sourcebooks, which detailed everything you need to know to run a Vampire the Masquerade Chronicle in Chicago. That is, except for that infamous Succubus Club, the focus of tonight's review. But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. Finally, I will note that things that I discuss here may well spoil your ongoing Chicago by Night game, so consider this your warning, folks. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has a start with the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized softcover book, and this is a particularly chunky source book, very floppy as well, and the front cover of each volume is decorated similarly to the two images for the two source books per volume contain that signature spiked VTM frame against the infamous green marble that brings nothing but doom and gloom upon the most hardcore of 5th edition fans. I will obviously focus on the artwork on the book in question, the Succubus Club, which I have mixed feelings about. Something I don't particularly like is the title font and colour choice for the volume. The font face, from the perspective of someone reviewing this volume nearly 30 years after its initial release, is rather dated. The colour choice is orange, so it's rather gross. If it ain't on here, it just looks wrong in my totally weird yet humble opinion. As for the rest of the art, all of the black and white illustrations do a beautiful job at capturing the various moods and emotions found within Vampire the Masquerade, particularly the full page spreads found at the beginning of each chapter, and pretty much everything done by the VTM legend Joss Timbrook, whose style I usually find a bit hit or miss for my own personal tastes. Every inch of the art is dripping with gothic atmosphere, accented with the aggressive punk that makes VTM stand out from other vampire media, a unique blend creating the signature goth punk that I feel has been lost over the years. Now, this isn't inherently a bad thing, as the game has to evolve with the times or feel as stagnant as the elders the neonates are fighting against, but it is hard not to feel a bit sad and nostalgic over the classic VTM art style. Being a first edition book, it uses a very unassuming layout. None of the classic borders or signature fonts that you would find from 2nd to 20th anniversary edition, just 2 columns per page, usually broken up with artwork in spadefuls. In comparison to said future books, this is quite boring in comparison, and can at times feel like reading an academic textbook rather than a TTRPG book, which was, from my very limited understanding, kind of the norm then, and TTRPG books were not physical works of art of themselves, at least not at the time, ignoring the written text for just a moment. That being said, when I first read this book and Chicago by Night first edition before it, I found the simpler presentation a breath of fresh air I did not feel that I needed, as many TTRPG books today really go to town making everything as colourful and expressive as the genre and tone deems it to be. It felt nice to just read and not pay too much attention to everything else. Of course, this isn't me saying that I don't like the more modern approaches to design, it's just another millennial reminiscing of the simpler times of yesteryear. When you open the book and flick past the contents and short yet dangerously seductive short story, you are greeted with an introductory chapter, or rather an introductory page, which details what it aims to cover and what you will find inside. Obviously, you would expect a book called The Succubus Club would have information on the Succubus Club, but there may be a couple of things that may surprise you. The first of which is its development within the creation of Vampire the Masquerade, in that it had plenty of use during the playtests of Vampire the Masquerade, with the only illustration available at the time being a rough sketch on a cocktail napkin, to quote the book directly. Including such a detail is totally unnecessary for the reader, but it shows a little insight to the amount of personal feelings the developers have with this setting that has grown into the complex, I should say. The other thing is that it includes 6 short stories, the final 2 being a 2-parter, all of which are centered in or around the Succubus Club in some aspect. The book begins properly with the Succubus Club itself, which still exists within the introductory chapter, and to say that it is a thorough chapter is a disservice. Much like the rest of the history presented in Chicago, of Chicago by Night before it, a lot is presented in very little space, and you will quickly digest what the club is presented, dating back to the times before the Civil War, its usage as a hub of criminal activity, fronted by Al Capone, its disco club years of the 1970s called Stardust, and its reinvention in the early 80s as the Succubus Club by the now late Ventru Brennan Thornhill, who, like 50% of Chicago's kindred, bit the dust when the guru bit them in two, or slashed them into ribbons, I don't remember, nor do I care. Porsche would take control of it in the 2nd edition onwards, where it would come the Anarch hotspot in 2nd edition to be reclaimed, kinda, by the Camarilla by the time we get to 20th anniversary edition. Following this is a fairly extensive write-up of the club's layout, which I thought was very lacking in 5th edition Chicago by Night, which I understand totally. The lack of information encourages the ST minds to flow and make it their own, but at the same time, its importance is clearly defined in said book, and I do not think there is a single VTM fan or admirer that has not heard of the Succubus Club, and I am even more sure that many would be a bit curious to see what it actually looks like. Maps are provided to each of the mega club floors, clearly labelled and accompanying the many paragraphs of text that describe every crook and cranny of the club, which to some may be too much information, as there is no way that everyone can include all that information in a single sitting. So you either spread it across many different trips to the club, or pick and choose what you, the ST, feel the most important of these details to include. I do feel that whilst it is initially overwhelming seeing all this information presented at once, I think it is good in this instance to provide too much rather than too little information. It also says that the developers really have given us a lot of thought and care to make it feel as realistic as possible and super easy to move it across any edition of ETM you're playing. My favourite floor here is the Labyrinth, the basement level where most of the scandalous and secretive scheming goes. Whilst being the very appropriate, edgy 90s name that it is, part of the Labyrinth is, in actual fact, a labyrinth that players could easily get lost in, fit with a D10 encounter table for STs to use. Though I feel that some of these results can only be employed once, the 10th result reveals the secret domain of Helena, which is fit with borderline silly amounts of defences that again really encourages players to explore it only once, for better and for worse. On the topic of defences, you can have fun learning employing what the club also has means of defence and who the regular patrons are, both kindred and kind, as well as local competition, giving the ST many different ways to provide plot hook after plot hook for their players. But if the inexperienced ST is unsure what to do with this large cast of characters, there's 6 stories to run, with the last 2 being a 2-parter, as I mentioned earlier on in this review, totaling about 110 pages of the book, meaning that said chronicles and one-shots take up more of the book than the Succubus Club itself. As such, I'm not going to give terribly deep thoughts on each of these, as I feel that will drag the length of this review out to boring amounts. So, whilst there will be spoilers for each of these, do not expect any deep analytical responses. The first of these stories, Annabelle's Party, revolves around Annabelle, the Toreador Primogen, hosting a party at the VIP section of the Succubus Club. Unfortunately, one of the prince's lieutenants causes a series of humiliating incidents that ruin the event. These include vampiric pornography, mechanical art, and a brilliant new musical composition, which is just a reversed Beethoven symphony, which is a clever musical Easter egg that you could look into at your leisure. The characters who are invited to the party, as it is clearly that the players do not get an invite by default, make an attempt to identify the culprit and influence the outcome. Whilst presented as a standalone one-shot, which is fairly straightforward to adapt, it is more inclined to be included as part of a more extensive Chicago chronicle that depends significantly on the city setting and political web. However, the notion of a Toreador's party gone awry is intriguing and could potentially be adapted to other locations and scenarios as well. Story number 2, Players of Pawns, involves the Succubus Club inasmuch as the characters are assumed to go there every night and unknowingly walk past the 2 ancient vampires, Critias and Dimitri, playing an actual game of chess, which makes it very interesting and easy to plant anywhere else in the world. In Player of Pawns, the players are chosen to be the living chess pieces in a game between 2 powerful vampires, Critias and Dimitri playing actual chess with the characters. Expected to be a long tale of political hoo-ha, but the twist is that this is a quick story as the PCs are kidnapped one by one as they are captured by Dimitri's pieces. The captured PCs are locked up in an airtight vault and are faced with a dilemma of what to do with the humans who are kept there for food. As the PCs continue to dwindle, they receive help from Critias's Queen, who provides them with information about Dimitri's haven. Here, they must defeat Dimitri's Queen, the Hag, and rescue their friends. This exposes the flaws in Dimitri's worldview, as he thinks that getting captured by Critias's pawns will make the characters mad at Critias, but not him. What this does is highlight how out of touch an elder vampire can be with modern sensibilities before being given the chance to confront the 2 vampires. It is certainly a very interesting and perhaps heavy-handed way to get your newbie players to understand the political chess game of the older vampires. The third story requires a bit of knowledge of Gary, mostly through the first edition story, Baptism by Fire, at the end of the first edition core book, but one could use the information presented in Let the Streets Run Red instead and in addition to this. The story centers around Modius, the Prince of Gary, the secret child of Annabelle, who arranged a group of religious fanatics to protest outside the Succubus Club in an attempt to condemn the use of blood dolls and the moral decay it represents. The situation almost leads to a physical altercation between the protesters and the club-goers, but Brennan Thornhill intervenes and diffuses the tension. However, Brennan's actions lead to a panic when the Episcopal priest, who is being mistreated by the crowd, reveals his true faith. Thornhill then puts immense pressure on the characters to eliminate the priest, forcing them to choose between what is convenient and what is right. The story is not just about the immediate events, but also focuses on the long-term consequences of the characters' actions, particularly those within Chicago, exploring both the social and moral implications of the characters' choices. Next is Death Sweet Sleem, which I feel is the weakest and most bombastic of the stories in this book, and one that would change your game world the most, as the writers walk the dodgy grounds of introducing viruses and disease within the world of darkness, something that have rarely done well. There is a new challenge for the PCs as they have to deal with a couple of vampire murders. They also have to run through a thrilling chase scene and eventually end up getting infected with a genetically modified disease that caused the first vampire in the tale to go crazy. To find the antidote, the characters must work together with a hunter who has a cure. However, the cure comes with a condition that puts the cast under servitude, just through the nature of the relationship. Although a few of the murders happen in the Succubus Club, the story has nothing much to do with Chicago. Finally, you have the two-part story, Child's Play, which consists of the two tales, The Paper Chase and Grand Illusion, though it's possible to run them separately, either with other activities in the middle of these two or independent of each other. It assumes the players are not fresh fledglings, yet new enough to introduce them to VTM Chicago. In the story of The Paper Chase, the characters are on the hunt for a fragment of the Book of Nod, only to find out it was a fake. The story progresses as they investigate the fence, the cellar, and some hunters who are also buyers, though it is quite easy for the players to miss at least one of these individuals. If they handle themselves well, then the story continues to the Grand Illusion, where the seller, who is a member of the Tremere clan, sends the characters on a mission to find Harry Houdini. Yes, that actual Houdini, who is now a Tremere vampire who has been ignoring orders. The characters will have to investigate a reporter, a magic shop, a vampire-heavy bar, and finally, the Succubus Club, where there will be a face-off. The story has a go along with the elder or do the right thing choice, with an added layer of elder/entrenched power versus the disenfranchised, which, if my tone wasn't clear enough, makes the decisions prior to this feel a bit weak. The Paper Chase can be used in any other setting, as the characters are not intended to find out the seller's identity in this particular story. On the other hand, Grand Illusion is closely tied to the Chicago setting. Finally, the book ends with a brief appendix, which is just the maps of the Succubus Club from earlier on in the book, but in one place, easy for STs to refer to and create handouts for their players if they so choose. The Succubus Club overall is an okay book. I purchased it with the intent of using the information about the Succubus Club for my then upcoming Chicago by Night Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition game with my friends as part of the chronicle The Sacrifice, as I felt what description that was presented of the most famous club in the world of darkness being informative yet ultimately rather lacking. The first chapter on the club itself is a must for any VTM ST wanting to include the Succubus Club on any level in their games, be it in Chicago or any roving pop-up ones that appear in revised V20 or 5th edition settings. This is what people are ultimately going to purchase the book for, not the tales that are presented in this book, which are nice, albeit a bit naff extras. Weaving VTM chronicles and one-shots are often more involved narratively, and thus emotionally than, say, a combat-heavy game like D&D, so given the task presented for one of the earliest VTM books and first attempts publishing VTM chronicles and adventure scenarios, I'd say, in retrospect, are okay. It is just that work brings down the over-enjoyment of the Succubus Club book as a whole, though for newer players of VTM who have no idea what they're getting into, or even a regular group that just wants some of those wacky superpowered crap early VTM is known for, you'll have a fun time with these half-baked tales. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book nothing short of a gory and highly visible death will satisfy him out of 10, as that is just as helpful as the proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Instagram and Blue Sky pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.